Hello. Today we're going to look at one of the tools that's available to think about some of these very complex and shifting social, sustainable, and technological systems. We're going to look at a new field called industrial ecology. New because it was first developed in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and it is still in the process of formulating itself. So it offers a number of interesting ways to think about not just these systems, but how we might create institutions and ways of thinking that help us approach these systems in new and different ways. So what is industrial ecology? The pure definition, it is the multidisciplinary study of industrial and economic systems and their linkages with fundamental natural systems. Now you ought to notice a couple of things immediately about even this short definition. The first is multidisciplinary. That automatically takes you out of any particular discipline that you might be working in at this point and encourages you to think more broadly about these systems. Industrial and economic systems and their linkage with natural systems. Think about the definition of sustainability that most people use these days. Economics, environment, and social systems, equity. And what you see immediately is that there's no direct linkage to social. Granted, industrial systems and economic systems of necessity are social, but this tells you something about where industrial ecology came from and what it's good at and what it may not be so good at. So what are the kinds of things that go into industrial ecology? Well, energy, materials, new technologies, technological systems, basic sciences, and so forth. One of the obvious things that should jump out at you when you look at this is that services are not directly involved. The second thing is that industrial ecology is pretty good at looking at energy and materials, not so good at looking at new technologies. Again, what this tells you is that industrial ecology came from a particular worldview, and that worldview tends to privilege looking at things like energy and materials and not be so concerned with new technologies, services, and particularly information structures and information flows. The word industrial is intended to be taken largely. But again, going back to the definition as it appears in most industrial ecology textbooks, and what you find is the focus remains on material and energy stocks and flows. What this tells you is this will give you reasonably good ways to approach environmental impacts. It probably is not going to give you very good ways to think about either new technologies or services and the cultural and social dimensions of systems. It includes all sectors and production and consumer behavior. This is where things begin to get a little interesting. Industrial ecology is intended to be a relatively objective way of looking at these systems. But what experience has shown is that European and American audiences respond differently if you propose to research things like consumption behavior. In Europe, looking at consumption behavior is considered to be a reasonable part of industrial ecology and is funded by governmental and quasi-governmental agencies. In the United States, looking at consumer behavior tends to be viewed a little skeptically. Consumer behavior is one of those individualistic behaviors that American culture tends to value or to privilege more than European culture. And of course, the most obvious thing you notice is that industrial ecology tends to have European and American roots, but most manufacturing is now done in Asia. So that tells you that there is a disconnect between this kind of activity and the manufacturing and the production for mass consumption markets that now occurs primarily in Asia. It's not that there aren't industrial ecology activities going on in Asia. It's that they're not as advanced or as institutionalized as perhaps in Europe and the United States. Some of the other aspects of it, industrial ecology, long-term understanding, human impact on fundamental natural system, rather than just looking at local perturbations. What this means is that if you want to study, for example, management of a sewage treatment plant, you should probably think about a discipline like environmental engineering, not industrial ecology. But again, notice how we focus back on natural systems, not social systems, and how this tends to have an environmentalist perspective. Large-scale systems, persistent systems, both through time and through space. So what this is doing is advancing ways to think about primarily environmental impacts over larger scale systems, both in time and in space, than most environmental activities were doing up until that point. So, to summarize briefly, industrial ecology is still an environmental approach. That's because industrial ecology comes out of the environmental movement. Environmentalism, as it shifted from viewing just the activities of waste management into looking more at how manufacturing was done, how products were designed, environmental science, environmental policy needed a broader perspective, and that's sort of provided the basis for industrial ecology. What that did not do is provide a good basis for integrating social systems. It focuses on resiliency, that is, how to protect systems, how to make sure they function better rather than simply looking at particular issues. Some of the techniques that you'd use would be mass flow analysis at different scales. At small scales, mass flow analysis is generally called life cycle analysis or life cycle assessment. We'll get into that in the next module. Which means that what you do is you take a product, a material, a process, and you try to understand it across its life cycle. Mass flow analysis is when you do this at larger scales. So for example, you might look at the flow of cadmium in agriculture in Germany. That's a mass flow kind of analysis. You look at the amount of cadmium going in from very broad inputs to the agricultural sector, and you look at what's coming out the other side. So what are some of the characteristics? Well, one important advance that industrial ecology made over the previous ways of thinking about the environment is it included a lot of different actors as integral to the system. Early environmentalism, of course, positioned industry as being the adversary. And so it was a very adversarial kind of approach that tended to view private firms as morally questionable, not as part of the system. Industrial ecology begins by taking private firms, NGOs, political structures, industrial systems as being part of what has to be looked at and evaluated. So the difference is between viewing industry, environmentalism, government as being adversarial and picking the party that you want to represent, as an activist say, which is perfectly legitimate, and trying to look at the system from a broader perspective, which understands all of those institutions as playing a part in the way these systems roll out in the real world. Now, one of the interesting things about industrial ecology, and I speak as a person who has been involved in the development of the field since its beginning, is that there is still a tension in the field between being analytical and scientific and normative and activist. What that means is that sometimes some people do industrial ecology to try to understand the system. In other words, let's say I'm looking at the flow of cadmium in German agriculture. Rather than saying the fertilizer firms are bad or the government is bad and we should have more regulations, the first step in industrial ecology, taken from the objective perspective, might be to say, okay, what is going in where, how is it being managed, and where are perhaps the biggest opportunities for exposure, for hazard, for risk? The second perspective might be to say, okay, I think cadmium is a real problem, and what I want to do is I want to do some work to show that it's a real problem, which is basically science being driven by activism and is very common in environmental science in some ways. So industrial ecology still struggles with this. Is it an effort to understand systems as they are, which is more of the objective scientific kind of perspective, or is it intended to provide ammunition for activism, which is more the normative or the subjective perspective? Now, as industrial ecology begins to extend itself into social realms, you see the same tension. So part of the question about industrial ecology itself is, should industrial ecology become simply a tool for activism, or should it become simply a way of looking at systems to provide information so that people can be activist or not activist, or private industry or government or NGOs, and change their behavior and perspectives? That question remains open.